Testing, testing, testing. Sound good? Okay. Okie dokie.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Linda. Hi, everybody.
Good morning. I think that has something to do with the AC. When the AC's on, it blinks out, but once it's warmed up, it stops.
That one goes to the projector.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But that's what's that?
That just comes on automatically.
Where's the remote for that?
Oh, yeah, you should have. Okay, there.
There you go. So now you see the news here. Well, shares stuff at home. Oh, I see. Now it shows you.
Hi, Ravi. We'll be starting momentarily, everyone. We're just working out a little technical kinks. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, everyone.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hello, all of you joining online. Let's go ahead and start with a refuge prayer. That's all right. Okay, so we'll recite the refuge verse the first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan.
Page 34.
I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye druparsho. And let's do a short meditation then before we begin the class. So again, we'll just spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath to calm the mind a bit, to come into this space with a bit more focus, alertness. And then I'll come in a few minutes and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for today. So I'll ring the bell here to begin. So let's begin to set our motivation by rejoicing in this amazing opportunity that we have to study these teachings. We've been talking about dependent origination, the most basic level being things arise in dependence upon causes and conditions. And think about all the causes and conditions involved in just being here in this moment. The building that we are in, wherever you're at. If you're watching on a computer or some device, everything that goes into creating that so you have the opportunity to join the teachings from a distance. If you're here in the Gompa, everything involved in being able to listen to these teachings, to watch the screen that the slides are projected on. We cannot deny the dependence that we have upon these causes and conditions. Just this moment of coming together to engage in the Dharma also requires even deeper conditions, the karma that we've created, that has ripened into this moment, into this time together. And the Buddha is simply telling us to look at that reality of how things originate. They arise in dependence upon other factors as a means to awaken, to see that things cannot then have any independent, autonomous existence. They cannot exist on their own. This world of interdependence that we are involved in speaks to that reality. The emptiness of all phenomena of existing on their own, of having any inherent or intrinsic existence. So from within that understanding of dependent arising and emptiness, we generate the motivation to help all beings to know that reality. Through our own investigation of this topic this weekend, coming to understand it more clearly, we hold the aspiration to be able to realize this at the deepest level, to actualize our potential, so we then can help others to do the same. And it's for this reason that we are here together, to help all beings to awaken to the nature of reality, and thus to have their full potential actualized, for them to achieve the state of Buddhahood as well. Okay. So again, before I go into the material again, I thought it would be useful to work with the PDF files that you do have access to, just to let you know what those are. We've got it fixed here, so everything comes up on the screen in the Gompa. Yay, thanks, Adam. I mean, Alex, I appreciate it. So what we have on the screen now is just the outlines of the text. I thought it would be useful just to have this on a single sheet, and you can see that the little verse numbers are all highlighted there, so they kind of fit with the outline. I'll kind of go back to this on occasion because it is useful to sort of ground us in where we are in the outline. By the way, this is what's called a hierarchical outline. An outline where you kind of start with numbers and you break those down. Of course, there's divisions of those, and then sometimes there's divisions of those. So it's kind of nice to alternate between numbers and letters. So you see there we have 2A, 2A, 2B, and then 2B has various presentations, 2B1, 2B2, and so on. These outlines come from one of the books that is on your book list that I'll show you in a moment. That's called Praise of Dependent Origination. I don't think you can find this anywhere. I picked it up in San Francisco, I think, at Seichen Ling many years ago. And never seen it again. But the actual text itself is here. And you'll see that I've put those outlines so that you can also find outlines with the text. I kind of made some of them a little bit bigger than others, so you see where the major outlines are, and some don't even have a box around them. But again, it can be a little hard sometimes because you get lost in the forest here if you don't have something to kind of guide you in regard to the overall outline. And we'll be starting the text a little bit later this morning. Then we have the book list, which, as I said, includes a couple of commentaries on this text. If you want to read those as well, because I obviously won't be able to cover it as extensively as some of these books do, as well as some on the life of Lama Tsongkhapa. I will actually be quoting from that first one there. The second one, Thupten Jinpa's new biography. That is really quite nice. I haven't read all of it yet, but it's really, really very well done. Then again, these commentaries, there are two that I know of that are published. This is, again, this small one, Lama Tsongkhapa's Praise of Dependent Arising, that I showed that the outlines came from. And then there's Tsongkhapa's Praise for Dependent Relativity, which was previously published by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives with another title. I think it was The Harmony of Dependent Arising and Emptiness by Lobsang Gyatso. So anyway, those are two that are out there. And then I actually haven't read all of this, so I'm a little hesitant in having it on the list. It's from the Nyingma tradition, at least a teacher in the Nyingma tradition who greatly admires Tsongkhapa's praise, because Lama Tsongkhapa obviously is not a Nyingma Lama, he's a Gelugpa Lama, but you might find some benefit to that. And it's available free on the internet, so you can just click on it and read that if you'd like to. I don't know how many pages it is, it's not horribly long. And then I put in a few books that have to do with the middle way view of emptiness and dependent origination that you might find useful. These are ones that I tend to recommend on this topic. Emptiness Yoga by Jeffrey Hopkins, How to Realize Emptiness by Genlam Rinpa, Insight into Emptiness, which is actually one of the best, by Khentsur Jampa Tekchok, but a little technical, but nonetheless very good. And then the middle way, Faith Grounded in Reason by the Dalai Lama, where he's commenting on those 3 chapters I mentioned last night of Nagarjuna. Chapters 18, 24, and 26 of Nagarjuna's text that we mentioned last night. And then Realizing the Profound View. The Dalai Lama with Thupten Chodron, Venerable Chodron, and the Dalai Lama have been putting together this whole series of books. You might have been buying them that have like the entire Lam Rim, and they're putting them out volume by volume. And that one in particular, I think it may be like the 7th volume, Realizing the Profound View, does go into dependent arising and is really quite useful. So the last one is the handout that we're working with, and that's where we're going to go right now to resume our studies. So again, most of you have a copy of that we've made available here in the Gampa. If you don't have a copy, does everyone have a copy?
There's some just outside the Gampa
Just
door.
outside the door.
Mm-hmm.
We
And
went
if-
through.
Oh, sorry. If you're online, or if you're in the Gampa, you can find all of these handouts online. If you go to kadampa-center.org, click on the first picture on our scrolling banner, and you'll see Gendon there, and then scroll down a bit to weekend workshop course materials, and they're all listed there.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. So we went through the first 2 sections of this. The first section was, I actually have to get all my little papers out here. I didn't have time to do that before we started. The first section was kind of an introduction of to this concept of dependent arising and emptiness, mostly using Elizabeth Napper's passages from her book, Dependent Arising and Emptiness, which, as I said, is a little more technical. It's not on your book list because it begins talking a lot about it in a very general way and then gets really deep into the subject using a lot of translations of texts. Then the second part had to do with regarding the middle way between the 2 extremes. This is what we're kind of continuing on in terms of what we're discussing right now with this third part. Let me take it off screen for just a moment to talk a little bit about this topic of the 2 extremes. As I said last night, we tend to fall, especially when we begin to do some analysis on emptiness. We either continue to fall in the extreme that we have been in since beginningless time of thinking things have some sort of concrete existence, that they exist from their own side, that they exist independently. Or when we begin to analyze, sometimes we start falling into a sort of nihilistic bent, thinking that things don't exist at all because they don't exist intrinsically or inherently. The reasoning of dependent arising helps us to avoid these 2 extremes of thinking things have that fictitious, fabricated way of existing, or thinking things lack any existence whatsoever. And this is why we point to dependent arising as being the technique that helps us to achieve the middle way between these two extremes. And finding that very fine middle way is our goal. And dependent arising is said to be the best way to achieve that. They even say that in the two words dependent arising, we already have some indication of how we can avoid both extremes. We tend to say that the emptiness, that side of the equation, keeps us from falling into the existence extreme. And then the non-existence extreme, we use dependent arising to say, yeah, but even though they don't have that inherent existence, things still do exist. They function. We can relate to them in our world. They're dependent arisings. But even in those two words, we already see that dependent means that things cannot be independent. We refer to this over here as our clinging to things as if they're independent, having their own entity, having their own thingness, kind of being able to stand on their own. That is refuted by them being dependent. But arising helps us to overcome the fact that things don't exist at all, right? Because they still arise. They're not dependent nothings, they're dependent arisings. So even in those two words, we are already trying to eliminate both of those extremes. And again, we might not fall into a nihilistic bent so easily until we begin the deeper analysis and start looking at things. And as was said in the teachings last night when we went through that one passage from Jeffrey Hopkins, at that point, when you're realizing emptiness, everything that is conventional is not in view because you're only seeing this vacuity, this lack, a lack of intrinsic or independent existence. You're not seeing any of the conventional phenomena, especially the phenomenon that you are analyzing. So if you're analyzing the I or whatever, and you come to a realization of the emptiness of it, that object you were using as the basis is not there. It's not present in the mind. What you are seeing is merely emptiness, especially at again, these deeper levels of realization. So this is what we're trying to continue with in regard to this third section, is looking a little bit more deeply on this, how we are avoiding these two extremes. This is from Jeffrey Hopkins' book, again, that I quoted from previously, Meditation on Emptiness, which also isn't on your list because even though it's got lots of juicy stuff in the beginning, is a lot of translations of various debates and things in the Indian Buddhist tradition and what have you. So it's a little challenging, as well as Tibetan masters that have contributed to that. So in the Madhyamika middle way system, all phenomena, both impermanent and permanent, because there are phenomena that are what we consider permanent. Impermanent means changing moment by moment. Everything that arises from causes and conditions doesn't stay the same for a single moment, continually changing. In the physical things that are in the world, we can see that happens, that from the moment it comes into existence, it begins a process of change. Some of it not, again, visible to the naked eye, but we will see it over time. Just like books and what have you, like the book that I was showing you here. I'm sure when I bought this, however many years ago, maybe almost 30 years ago, the pages were nice and white and crisp, but now they're kind of yellowish, right? This is the indication that things have been changing over time. It's not like when I picked it up 30 years later, it suddenly turned yellow. The pages don't do that, right? They turn gradually, they fade. Over time, things are changing, degrading, kind of arising, abiding, and disintegrating momentarily. This is the nature of everything in our physical world, and of course our minds are also going through a process of continual change. Everything in the world of consciousness is in the same boat. And even those things that aren't form or consciousness, that what we call kind of the compositional factors that aren't associated with either of those, they also go through a process of continual change. All of that phenomena that's impermanent is what we normally just think of as the world around us. But there are also even some phenomena that are permanent. Let me take it off screen since I am talking a little bit here. What are the phenomena that are permanent? Well, one of the big ones is emptiness. They say that actually the emptiness, for example, of I, each of your respective I's that you hold to very dearly, the emptiness of that I doesn't change moment by moment, while the I is constantly changing, right? Or the emptiness of your body. Your body is a phenomenon that is impermanent, that changes moment by moment, whereas the emptiness of your body, the lack of inherent existence of your body, does not change moment by moment. Why? Because it is a simple negation. Does the negation of intrinsic existence at this moment, is it any real different than at this moment? It's the same thing. It doesn't have a changing quality. So we do have permanent phenomena. Another one that is used frequently, and it's a little hard one to get our heads around, is what's called uncompounded, unconditioned space. Space is referring to the absence of any obstructive contact. The reason why you can sit where you're sitting is because there's an absence of obstructive contact. The reason why the whole world, the universe, exists is because there's an absence of obstructive contact that allows for things to be in that space. So this is a negation. It's a lack. It's an absence. It becomes more of an abstract concept than something we point to. I mean, can you even really point to space? You can go, oh, well, there's space up there and space down there and what have you. But what do we really mean by space? A lack of anything that will obstruct being in that space. So it's also what's said to be a permanent phenomenon. It doesn't change. It can be occupied by Don sitting in this space or not sitting in this space, but it's still an absence of obstructive contact. Okay, so anyway, there are a few others. I won't go into them in great detail, but this is essentially saying that whether we're talking about permanent or impermanent phenomena, they all are dependent arisings. They all are, therefore, empty of inherent existence. Again, that term we used last night, that's the Sanskrit, pratitya samutpada. Through the reason of their being dependent arisings, their emptiness is established. The Questions of Sagaramati Sutra says, those which arise dependently are free of inherent existence. Again, getting at the equivalency of these two things. If things exist in a manner of dependency, they therefore lack any independent existence. Continuing on, let me pull the screen up a little bit so it's more central. Dependent arising is said to be the king of reasonings. Remember, we started last night with that quote about how the Buddha teaches all of this, various reasonings to help sentient beings to see reality, to be free then of the tree of samsara that I had on the screen last night, to be no longer under the control of those factors because their root is ignorance that adheres to inherent existence. It's the king of reasonings because it can, without residue, overcome both extremes. So the reasoning that we use is all phenomena do not inherently exist. That's the thesis. It's got a subject, all phenomena do not inherently exist. That's the predicate. That's what we're putting forward as our thesis. Well, you have to give a reason. If you're going to, this is logic, basic reasoning, right? Why? Because of being dependent arisings. That's kind of interesting. If we use that with somebody who doesn't adhere to dependent arising being equivalent to emptiness, they have to kind of scratch their heads a bit because it doesn't make sense. In fact, we're going to get into this whole concept as we go through the text. And Tsongkhapa in his text points out how he cannot believe that people who hold to a dependent arising can't adhere to emptiness. Because for most people, when they hear that things arise in dependence upon factors, they still think there must be something kind of essential and intrinsic within that in order for it to exist. I'll go into this in more detail. One thing I might point out with this, again, I said this is kind of a basic premise of logic, just so you know. I mean, many of you went through some sort of logic class in your university studies, perhaps, or I don't know where, but we have that little kind of three statements, right? That Aristotle is a man, all men are mortal. Therefore, Aristotle is mortal, right? And you could put that into a similar statement, right? You could say Aristotle is mortal. That's your thesis. Why? Because he is a man, with the implicit understanding that all men are mortal. So if Aristotle is a man, then therefore all men are mortal and Aristotle is mortal, so makes sense. It's a similar logic. And it's interesting that even though we have this kind of Western European model of coming about things, Tibetans and Indian Buddhists and everything were adopting the same model of kind of how to work with getting at what is real, what is true. This is a whole process that, again, is used very extensively in debating. You've seen the pictures of the monks in the debating grounds, and nuns now in the debating grounds, debating all these various topics. They're using these sorts of statements and reasons to be able to investigate the teachings more deeply. So again, for many of us, when we hear this kind of that things don't inherently exist because of this reason of being dependent arisings, it takes deeper investigation. He goes on to say, or in its most powerful form, all phenomena do not inherently exist because of being dependently imputed. This is where we're going to go into. Then the next topic is the 3 levels of dependent designation or dependent origination. Okay? So let's go through what Jeffrey Hopkins says on the basis of this. He says, here, all phenomena means each and every phenomenon. Through ascertaining the reason that all phenomena are dependent arisings, the extreme of annihilation is avoided. Again, over on this side, that falling into that abyss of thinking things don't exist at all. And the realization of the dependent arising of causes and effects is gained, that we understand that everything arises on the basis of various factors, and so therefore it cannot possibly be non-existent. We're never saying that I don't exist, or chairs don't exist, or tables, or anything doesn't exist. We're simply saying things don't exist intrinsically because they arise in dependence upon factors. They are still continuing to exist. Therefore, non-existence doesn't make sense. Through ascertaining the thesis that all phenomena do not exist inherently, the extreme of permanence is avoided, and realization of the emptiness of all phenomena is gained. So this is how it's traditionally set out, is that again, by saying that things have a dependent existence, therefore they have to exist. Can't have non-existence over here. To say that things lack inherent existence means they can't exist independently on their own, and therefore we refute that extreme. So the emptiness on this side, the dependent arising on this side, counteracts both extremes. And as I said earlier, even just dependent arising itself can do both if we analyze again those 2 terms that are involved in it. That things are dependent, so they cannot exist independently, and they are arising, so they cannot exist, or cannot be utterly non-existent. Let's continue on. Let me again pull the screen up a little bit, because there's kind of an interesting take on it, that the unique prasangika view, remember this is what we're studying, is prasangika madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school. He says, furthermore, through ascertaining the reason that all phenomena are dependent arisings, the extreme of permanence is also avoided, because it is realized that phenomena are just interdependently existent, not inherently existent. Kind of similar to what I was saying by just breaking out the word dependent from it. If things are dependent, they cannot be independent. They have an interdependent nature. Then, through ascertaining the thesis that all phenomena do not inherently exist, the extreme of annihilation is also avoided. Why? Because it's realized that only inherent existence is negated, not existence in general. We can't fall into an extreme of annihilation and say things don't exist, because that's not what the thesis is saying. The thesis says things don't inherently exist. The Buddha never said things don't exist at all. The Buddha found a very kind of sliver of existence that we are holding to. It's quite big for us, but in the end, it's just a little sliver of a conception that we are putting on top of things that creates all the problems that we have. That is what's being negated. Existence itself is left alone, because existence itself is in the very slightest form, as mere nominal existence. So it says here, as a yogi progresses in understanding dependent arising, realization of how the reason and the thesis each avoid the 2 extremes becomes subtler and subtler. And this is actually what we're kind of aiming for, is just through continual investigation. It's through our study, through the wisdom that arises from sitting in a room, hearing teachings, reading books like the book list I put together, working with bringing in that information about emptiness and dependent arising. We generate already a view that we can begin to find a basis for pursuing our studies. Then we begin to investigate them through the wisdom that arises from contemplation and reflection. I talked about these wisdoms the other night, right, with the talk on faith. Then it becomes a little bit more ingrained, because we've come to see the validity of it through our own personal investigation. And then through our meditation, we have the final level of wisdom that will arise, which has to be done in conjunction with a deeper state of meditative stabilization, but will actually allow us to change the fabric of our minds, to no longer have that belief in how things appear and how we've been fictitiously holding them to exist, because we've replaced it with wisdom. We've replaced it with reality, with truth. And that's the understanding of emptiness that we want to get to through understanding the very subtle nature of dependent arising. So this is what we're embarking on in terms of our studies this weekend, and really getting to be clear about what that is in its very deepest level. To do this, I also want to share, many of you know this text, another text by Lama Tsongkhapa, a wonderful text to explore, his 3 principal aspects of the path. There's a very similar verse in there that is recapping exactly what I just went through with Jeffrey Hopkins' words. Furthermore, appearance eliminates the extreme of existence, right? So the fact that things appear and are dependently arising actually works over here too. It keeps us from falling into that extreme, because if things exist dependently, they can exist independently, inherently. And emptiness eliminates the extreme of non-existence, the nihilistic view, because we're only eliminating inherent existence. We're not eliminating mere existence. We find that middle way again by refining our understanding over time, and both extremes fall to the side, and we're not caught in them by any means. He goes on to then say, if you realize how emptiness manifests in the manner of cause and effect, dependent arising, then you are not captivated by these wrong notions holding extreme views. This is the way to be free of these 2 extremes and to find the middle way that is between both of them. Okay, so just to kind of tie it back to that text that some of you may have studied. This is Jeffrey Hopkins continuing on this. He's seeing that the reasoning of dependent arising refutes all extremes, and that this teaching is a quality elevating Buddha above all other teachers. Nagarjuna praised Buddha in the opening verses of his treatise on the middle way. Why I brought this in is because what we're looking at in this weekend is a praise to the Buddha for the exact same reason, for teaching dependent arising. And this is Lama Tsongkhapa, the text we're studying, following in the footsteps of Nagarjuna, the great master, who began his fundamental treatise, the text that we quoted from last night, with these 2 verses. I bow down to the perfect Buddha, the best of propounders, who taught that what dependently arises has no cessation, no production, no annihilation, no permanence, no coming, no going, no difference, no sameness. These are what are called these kind of 8 views that are all being refuted, that we need to kind of understand. We're talking about kind of anything existing inherently in these ways. These don't exist at all. Is free of the elaborations of inherent existence and of duality, and is at peace. So he's praising the Buddha for having taught this method, and being able to refute any of these 2 extremes. And as I said, our text is doing the same thing. So let's move on to the text. Again, I'm kind of stopping there in regard to, I'm sorry, we've got one more thing. One more thing to cover, sorry. Maybe perhaps the most important thing. Everything we've done is important, but this is the 3 levels of dependent arising. Let me get that on the screen. Actually, let me talk about it. I'd like to talk about it using an example first. And some of you may remember the clothespin. You remember the clothespin? I've done this here at Kadampa Center before. And I actually forgot my clothespin. Elise was kind enough to find me a clothespin at her house. Believe it or not, this was the only clothespin she had in the drawer. So we only have one to work with, so I can't lose it. But so when I hold this up, right, everyone says clothespin, right? It's kind of, we've all come to know this, even though probably a lot of people don't use them for drying clothes anymore, because a lot of people have dryers and what have you, but we can begin to analyze the first level quite easily, right? Causes and conditions. I mean, what are some of the causes and conditions that lead to having this clothespin? Tree, good for the wood, the wooden pegs. The ore that goes into the spring, the spring itself, because we have kind of 3 main parts here that each have their own respective causes and conditions. Of course, there's also the people in the factory that make these, right? I'm sure there's still a factory. I don't think they're made by machines completely yet, but they've got all these little parts, all the little pegs, and they've assembled them. You have the people who came up with the design for this. One student, when I had taught on this, he actually found an article in National Geographic magazine when he was traveling once, that there was an exhibit at the Smithsonian of the history of the clothespin. When I was growing up, they actually had clothes pegs too, right? That didn't have a spring. They were just a solid piece of wood that would be tight enough to close on the clothesline so that it would keep your clothes from flying away. Anyway, there are like a whole evolution of how this whole thing formed, right? The minds of beings who come up with devices to help us to do the things we do. Tablets and iPads and all these various things, right? That we have due to the creative minds of human beings. So we can actually find myriad causes and conditions. In fact, we could say there are infinite causes and conditions. In this book that isn't on your book list that I've actually mentioned the other night when I was talking about faith, The Logic of Faith by Elizabeth Mattis Namgyal, she says that, she quotes that Carl Sagan thing that some of you may recall, where Carl Sagan said that if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, well, you have to invent the universe, first, and then you can create it from scratch. But of course, she goes on to say, but actually you have to go further back than that, right? Because the universe didn't come into existence without something else, like His Holiness often says. It's okay to say there's a Big Bang, but it's not the first Big Bang. There's something before that. We can't say that things came into existence from nothing. So I could say that everything in the world contributes to, and beyond causes this clothespin to be here. But we won't for now. That's a pretty simple level, and most people get that. And we all have really great confidence in that first level of cause and effect. Now, many of you, I'm sure, in the summer might have a little plot of land in your backyard or outside I'm forgetting the names of things. Might have a little garden bed or something that you might grow things out in. You know that you have to kind of do that in order to have those vegetables at the end of summer. You don't just expect that they're going to crop up out of the ground without any tending to them, putting the seeds in, making sure there's nutrients in the soil, making sure they get water and sun and what have you. So we have a lot of confidence at this level. It should be easy to see that things don't exist independently, but nonetheless, let's go on to the second level, which does get a little subtler. And that's the fact that if we do take this apart, at least into its main parts, this one is a bit tighter than the one that I have. You're right, Elise. It's a little harder. We have at least three main parts, right? We have two that are pretty identical. In fact, I'm sure they're identical because it would be crazy to have only left and right or something in two bins at the factory. They just grab two of them and you put them together. We have these two parts that are wooden, and we have this part that is metal. Each of these has their own parts too, right? Because we could go down and investigate, and this is what scientists do now, to go down into deeper and deeper levels of what exists in terms of various kind of particles and subparticles, and they're down to quarks and subquarks. I don't know where they're at now. I don't really follow that. It's not on my feed but we can say for now there are three parts, right? Well, a clothespin depends upon its parts, right? If you don't have all the parts, you don't have a clothespin. If I went to the store and I bought a bag of clothespins and it was just a bag of these, I'd be really disappointed, right? I'd be like, oh, they didn't give me clothespins. I'd take it back. I'd say, this isn't a bag of clothespins. Because these are not clothespins, right? They're the parts, and put the three parts together, you then have the whole clothespin. Let's go to the deeper investigation, though, not just a dependence upon parts. Let's see, well then, where does clothespin come from? So if I hold this part up, we can say this isn't a clothespin then, right? Right? And everyone will agree this isn't a clothespin. I'll set it over there. Don't have anything up my sleeve. This is also not a clothespin, right? Okay. And the last part, this is also not a clothespin, correct? Okay. So then, again, I'll do this out in the open. You can see it. I'm just taking the little parts here and putting them together. This one goes, if I can get it again, around there. There's a nice little groove that they put in the factory there to do that. And then there's another part over here. I do the same thing on this side. Okay. Three parts are assembled. Okay, now what do I have in my hand? Clothespin, right? Well, it wasn't in the three parts, right? I didn't find it in any of the parts. Where did it come from? Did I add anything? Did I say, oh, we got a fourth part that's called clothespin that now is here, right? It comes because, some people will say, well, it's now assembled, and that's true. Because it has to have sort of the functionality of a clothespin. The metal piece isn't going quite in the way I want it to, but there we go. But that is true, because again, if you just got the parts, if you went there and say all the parts were there in the bag, you'd still be a little disappointed, right? Because they need to be assembled to serve the function of a clothespin. You have to have the two wooden pegs with the metal spring. But nonetheless, I didn't add anything. Clothespin came from our designation, our minds imputing that this is now a clothespin. It serves the function of a clothespin. But there wasn't a clothespin in any of the parts, what we call the basis of imputation, the basis of labeling. And it doesn't come from anywhere else, so therefore it can only really come from our minds, only from a conceptual designation. And us all agreeing to refer to these things as clothespin, and that being great, we're just satisfied at that level. That's what we mean by kind of worldly renown. There's nothing more than that when it comes down to how things exist, is our deciding that this is that is something else, and so on. Having some conventional agreement. A little bit later, we'll look at kind of the criteria that are involved in determining what is a valid conventional object, what actually exists. That's a very subtle way that things exist in the end, is by mere designation, a conceptual mind looking at something and deciding this is this, that is that. There's nothing from the side of what's in my hand that makes it a clothespin. Clothespin is what we determine this to be. And over time, again, maybe this might go out of existence because we just don't use these things anymore. I use them at home to close like bags of chips or something like that, right? Keeps them nice and fresh. Elise was pointing me out some new things that she has that they're really quite effective in sealing the whole bag. But, there are things that do that too. And maybe at home I get really casual and I say, have you seen the snack bag, clip or whatever? I don't call it a clothespin anymore. It can be valid in that way, because once we get into the realm of designating things, whatever it's designated where there's a common agreement is good enough. Just like in the same way that if Tashi, I don't know, maybe Tashi doesn't probably chew on wood, but if there was a dog that really liked to chew on things, some dogs, Labradors are like this, right? You have to give them something to chew constantly. If there was a dog that, did that, and I threw this across the room, they would see it as a chew toy, at least initially. They might get into the metal spring and have a problem, might start chipping their teeth or something. But they would love chewing by digging their teeth into the wood, right? Does that mean that that dog is chewing on a clothespin from its perspective? No, it doesn't know clothespin, has no concept of clothespin. But for the dog, it's equally valid as chew toy or whatever their concept of that is, right? There's nothing that from the side of the object that makes it into something specific, something with its own identity, something with that inherent in it. This is another way that we can come to understand this very subtle level of dependent arising. Things don't have their own identity. We all agree to call these various things what they are. They don't have that identity from their own side. In fact, I'll point out here, because I think it's really a useful thing, that Lama Zopa Rinpoche says there's actually a process by which we go about getting into trouble with regard to things. Because something will appear to us like this basis. If before you knew what a clothespin was, I don't remember when I first learned what a clothespin was. My mother would probably be hanging clothes out and I would play with them or whatever, But before you learned this, there was kind of a basis that appeared to you and someone told you the name of this, right? And in English, it's clothespin. I've taught this, use this in Spain, and they have another word, pina or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting name for it. So it won't have the same name in all these various languages, but they have a concept that is similar in terms of something that's used, on a clothesline to hold clothes. Once I learned that name, that's the first step. I say that actually there's also another step involved where it seems to be that clothespin is out here now, established on its own. That's all an appearance to our minds. This is one of the reasons why it's really hard to extricate ourselves from this view of things existing independently, is because they also appear this way. I mentioned this a little bit last night. This is a false appearance that we have around us all the time. We're like fish in water and we can't see the water because we're swimming in it constantly. It's the very stuff of which everything is appearing. It all seems to be real from its own side. Last night we used the idea of like a dream object, right, as being a comparable analogy for what we're dealing with in our waking life. In dreams, everything appears to have a fictitious level of existence, and we're agreeing to it. Your dream objects appear to be real. You relate to them as if they're real. And when you wake up from your dream, you come to understand they didn't have that reality at all. They appeared real because in the dream state, that's what they do. They come up into our sphere of consciousness, and all this stuff is happening, and we're agreeing to it, and we get all emotional about what's happening. That's what's going on in the waking state. Everything appears real. And that's due to this error that we've had that has created this kind of imprint in our minds that ripens into that false appearance. And then the third step is that we agree to it. So the first step is something appears and we label it. We give it that designation, clothespin. It now seems to be clothespin from its own side. The clothespin label has absorbed into the object, and it seems to have its own clothespinness, if you will. And then we agree to that. We don't even question it. Most beings will never question it until they run into these teachings, until they hear that things don't exist in this way. They don't have their own identity. And as was said last night by Don Brown when he was here, he said that, what's really important is that we get clear about what that false appearance is, what that gakcha, that object of negation is, that the reasoning of dependent arising is negating. Things having their own entity. As soon as I picked this up, from the table, what happened? You immediately said, oh, Don's holding a clothespin, right? You kind of immediately got that thought because you think there's a real clothespin here. I think there's a real clothespin here. Until we begin to undermine that, we can't get past the third step, which is our agreeing to that, assenting to that appearance. We get rid of that, and then we still have to get rid of the appearance. This is why the Buddhist path is a bit involved and difficult, is because you not only get rid of the thought that things exist inherently, eventually you get rid of these subtle imprints that cause this false appearance, so that then you have nothing that is obscuring your mind. Then you know things for what they are. You know things as simply being merely imputed, merely designated through the minds of other beings. Everyone agreeing that this is a clothespin, this is a table, this is a computer, this is a chair, this is a person. So this is what's going on in this section. Let's go through the words. I don't think we'll need to say much because the words themselves now in this section I think will be quite clear. This is from His Holiness's wonderful book, Ethics for the New Millennium. As a means to understanding this complexity, I find the concept of dependent origination, in Tibetan it's Tendel, articulated by the Madhyamika middle way school of Buddhist philosophy, to be particularly helpful. According to this, we can understand how things and events come to be in three different ways. At the first level, the principle of cause and effect, whereby all things and events arise in dependence on a complex web of interrelated causes and conditions, is invoked. This suggests that no thing or event can be construed as capable of coming into or remaining in existence by itself. For example, if I take some clay and mold it, I can bring a pot into being. The pot exists as an effect of my actions. At the same time, it is also the effect of a myriad of other causes and conditions. These include the combination of clay and water to form its raw material. Beyond this, we can point to the coming together of the molecules, atoms, and other minute particles, which from these constituents, which are themselves dependent on innumerable other factors. Then there are the circumstances leading up to my decision to make a pot. And then there are the cooperative conditions of my actions as I give shape to the clay, on the wheel or whatever. All these different factors make it clear that my pot cannot come into existence independently of its causes and conditions. Rather, it's dependently originated. Again, I think we have no difficulty getting that concept and all the myriad causes and conditions that are involved in all the things that we experience. That first level is really unique to those impermanent phenomena that I just mentioned. Again, this twofold division of phenomena. Impermanent being those things that change moment by moment. Permanent meaning those things that aren't caused and therefore don't change moment by moment. Everything that is caused is impermanent. Therefore, everything that is caused arises based on its causes and conditions and changes momentarily. That's that first level of dependent origination. On the second level, Tendel can be understood in terms of the mutual dependence which exists between parts and whole. Without parts, there can be no whole. Without a whole, the concept of parts makes no sense. The idea of whole is predicated on parts, but these parts themselves must be considered to be wholes comprised of their own parts, right? Because when we take this apart into the three parts that I had, right, even one of these pegs still is a whole that has its own parts, right? Because that is got, the little one side with the various bevels, marks, what have you, and then the sharpness here at the edge and the roundness and whatever. All of those are various parts of it. And then, of course, molecular parts and what have you. So everything has parts and whole in relation to it. I think this is why they keep doing this investigation deeper and deeper into physical realities to try to find, is there something that's kind of partless? Even in the Buddha's time, they had this concept of things being partless, and they refuted it, because even if you get down to some minute particle, it still will be involved in other things around it. So it has to have a top, a bottom, a left, a right, whatever directions. To find a directionally partless particle would be impossible, they say. I don't know what scientists think about that. I'm sure His Holiness has put it forward to some of them. But so this is an important understanding, but it's also a bridge to get us into the third level, because then once more we see all these various parts as being a basis of designation, of imputation. And we come to understand this very subtle level. Now, His Holiness talks about this third level, first in regard to what we sometimes call mutual reliance, which also gets into a field of conceptuality, of kind of seeing things in regard to the concepts we have about them. Like we said last night, of near and far, this is included in this third level at the beginning. And then to get to the deeper level of understanding that even the identity of things is merely designated. On the third level, all phenomena can be understood to be dependently originated because when we analyze them, we find that ultimately they lack independent identity. This can be understood from the way in which we refer to certain phenomena. For example, the words action and agent, or like the walker and the walking, right? We walk, and that's what a walker does. Someone who walks is a walker. Presuppose one another. So to call someone a walker presupposes they have the action of walking. Talk about the action of walking by a person, well, it presupposes that there's a walker there. These are interdependent phenomena. So do parent and child, right? You can't be a parent without having a child. And if you're a child, you had a parent, right? You presuppose each other in that way. Someone is a parent only because he or she has children. Likewise, a daughter or son is so called only in relation to them having parents. The same relationship of mutual dependence is seen in the language we use to describe trades or professions. Individuals are called farmers on account of their work on the land. Doctors are so called because of their work in the field of medicine. Of course, we have a lot of things, short and long, here and there, even self and other. These are both kind of designated on the basis of self is the person we are, and other is everyone else. And every one of us is a self that has other, right? There's no kind of absolute to that. It's all merely designated, merely imputed, depending upon our relation. But as it says here on the screen, in a more subtle way, whoops, I should get that out of the screen because I'm mirroring my screen. In a more subtle way, things and events can be understood in terms of dependent origination when, for example, we ask, well, what exactly is a clay pot? What exactly is a clothespin? When we look for something we can describe as its final identity, we find that the pot's very existence, and by implication that of all other phenomena, is to some extent provisional and determined by convention. When we ask whether its identity is determined by its shape, function, its specific parts, that is, being compounded of clay, water, and so on, or in the case of the clothespin, being compounded of wood and metal, we find the term pot or clothespin is merely a verbal designation. There is no single characteristic which can be said to identify it, nor does indeed the totality of its characteristics. We can imagine pots of different shapes that are no less pots. And because we can only really speak of its existing in relation to a complex nexus of causes and conditions, viewed from this perspective, it has no one defining quality. In other words, it does not exist in and of itself, but rather is dependently originated. It's the same with clothespin, right? I mean, I told you about the Smithsonian exhibit. There are many things that were labeled clothespin over time that were very different. I mean, it was quite interesting. I should travel with that little thing to show people. But I mean, they were really kind of bizarre looking things that you wouldn't think would be used even to hold up clothes. But it has evolved and changed over time with the same label. We have different things that are clothespins. We have different things that are pots. But there's nothing, again, that is identifying them as such, except our labeling it as that. Now, you might think it's quite caught up in language, and it is. I think even Wittgenstein, to talk about Western philosophy, has came to a lot of the same conclusions around language and its use and kind of giving shape to our world. But we even have it at a conceptual level. I think prelingual, if we look at like infants who are being raised and taken care of by somebody, they come to understand certain things conceptually, though they have no language at all. They have the way of screaming, or maybe their screams are different when they want different things. I don't know. I never raised children. I skipped that part of life. But essentially, they've got some concept. Like when they want mother's milk, they have a concept of what it is that they want, right? Something that they're screaming for, and then when they get it, they have oh, this is what I was looking for. Thank you, appreciate it. Right? But they don't have all the language around it. So it's happening at a very subtle conceptual level. I've never heard a Tibetan Buddhist teacher say this, but I said it to the teaching assistant at the master's program, and he thought it sounded okay. We in essence, organize our world through our thoughts, and then the problem is we then think the world is already organized that way, that we're kind of finding it to be organized that way. And in fact, we are introduced to the world as if it were organized that way by the people who give us all these labels, right? I've organized this whole thing to be called a tablet, and then you go to the store and you say, I want to buy a tablet. Okay, well, I'll show you the tablets and blah, blah, blah. All these things are based on our kind of conventional agreement at this very subtle level, but we still think that things have some sort of identity because they were organized that way by human beings, and therefore we can relate to everything, and they seem to have that existence from their own side. Dependent arising says, no, at the very subtlest level, they're just merely called that. And of course, if an ant was crawling on my tablet here, it would have a very different experience of the tablet, right? Crawling along on the screen, probably making the screen come on or something at times, perhaps. I don't know if it weighs enough to do that, but this little kind of crawling thing would have a very different experience of it. Wouldn't think of it as tablet at all, just like a smooth surface to go skating on or something, that's it, right? Beings have different experiences of things. And if I took this to a country where they had no idea, I mean, there probably still are cultures where they don't have any idea what a tablet is. And you open it up, I mean, they might think it's some sort of magic world that you're going into or something, right? And that's their view of it. They're holding it to be. And in some ways it is. Later on, I'll show a nice example that comes from a movie. Well, won't watch the movie, but we'll kind of use the example to kind of get at this. Things are designated by human beings, by conceptual awareness, and by even other creatures, other animals, other existing beings. They all go through a process of designating the world around them. And then they think the world is already the way that they've designated it. We'll take some questions shortly. Let me do just a little bit more of this handout. So if I get my screen share, go back to that. We have a little passage from Emptiness Yoga, again, one of the books on your list. Dependence upon causes and conditions is narrower, right? Because it's only those things that arise from causes and conditions. Dependence upon parts is as wide as everything in all the universes. Dependence upon an imputing consciousness, though, just as wide in its scope of application, is more difficult to realize. What's kind of interesting, we're going to go into this a little bit later, all three of these, though, are doorways to the same truth. We actually come to understand dependent arising and emptiness through any of them. And we'll see Tsongkhapa does this in the text. He talks about dependence upon causes and conditions, the first level, as being one of the main reasons that can help us to get into a view of emptiness. We do still have to kind of understand that things have this subtlest level of dependent existence, that they are mere designations, mere imputations. But nonetheless, the grosser levels will also help us to get there. So I think I have maybe one more thing to share. No, I don't have anything more to share. Let's go to talk a little bit about the author of this text. So most of you know a bit about Lama Tsongkhapa. His dates are 1357 to 1419, which I always find kind of interesting because if we look at what was going on in our advanced Western civilization at that time, this was like the Dark Ages or Middle Ages. I mean, it was like really pretty horrible things happening in our world, right? We think we're so, evolved. And here in Tibet, there was like all this wonderful scholastic pursuit of these deep philosophies that came out of India and everything. And of course, at the time of the Buddha, that even, predated this by quite a few centuries. So we can see that the advanced thinking that was going on in that part of the world, we had nothing like this in our world, though, still parts of our civilization that did do investigations into some of these things. He is the founder of what's known as the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. There are 4 main traditions. I mentioned when we went through the book list that there's a Nyingma commentary on this text. Why I find that kind of strange is because they do tend to follow the leaders of those particular schools. Nyingma was the first. It started in roughly the 7th century in Tibet through Shantarakshita coming into Tibet, Padmasambhava, the great master. All of those kind of created the initial lineage of the teachings in Tibet. And then about the turn of the millennium, there were the Kagyu lineage formed. Teachers in that tradition are like Milarepa. They have their own kind of lineage that broke off, and based on the teachings of those masters, they continued on. And then there was the Sakya, and then Geluk was the last to form. Sakya was about 100 years after Kagyu, maybe not quite. Lama Tsongkhapa studied all these other traditions. Because when he grew up, there wasn't Gelugpa, right? I mean, he's the founder of that. I don't think he intended to necessarily find a new school, but he wanted to clarify the view that he felt had gotten a bit muddied. He was wanting to discern it most correctly and then be able to help others to know that truth. This text that we're looking at is quite interesting because it was composed. There are 2 different dates for this, either 1397 or 1398, and that's because, again, we're dealing with lunar calendars in Tibet. They don't have the Western Gregorian calendar and all of that. They base it on lunar cycles. So they know what lunar date people were born and when they did various things, but they don't necessarily always have an equivalent in terms of when that is in our Western calendar. But there's a wonderful story about this because Lama Tsongkhapa had gone kind of with a group of monks to do a sort of investigation into these profound topics and was with them on a sort of extended retreat. And I want to read this. This is from, again, Thupten Jinpa's biography of Tsongkhapa, because it's really quite inspiring. Content with what he had been able to achieve in Nyal, Tsongkhapa and his group, by now over 30 in number, returned once again to the retreat in the Wolka Valley, known as Lading, which translates to gods floating in the air. He would remain there for a full year, continuing with his intensive meditative practice and conducting teachings for his small band of wandering contemplative monks. Throughout all this, taking to heart what his meditation deity Manjushri had advised during their last encounter, that he should critically reflect on the great treatises and compare them against Manjushri's own oral instructions, Tsongkhapa redoubled his efforts in the ongoing quest for deeper insight into emptiness. In fact, it's said that through his level of practice, his guru was appearing to him in the form of Manjushri. There's a Manjushri Tanka in here, I'm sure, yes? Is there? Back there. Yeah. The second one from the end, you have White Tara, and then you have Manjushri, I think, if I'm seeing it correctly. Isn't that it? Yeah, okay. He's kind of holding a flaming sword of wisdom in one hand, and then the text on the lotus, that is the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, in the other. So he was already having these pretty mystical visions of like his guru appearing to him in this enlightened form to give him these instructions. I'll share maybe a little later one of the pieces of advice he had for him, but he says one night, Tsongkhapa had a prophetic dream in which he saw Nagarjuna surrounded by 4 of his principal interpreters, Aryadeva from around the 2nd century, Buddha Palita from around the 5th century, Bhavaviveka from the 6th century, and Chandrakirti from the 7th century. They were all engaged in deep conversation, kind of like, the ultimate place to hang out. If you're going to hang out at that place with all these amazing beings who have discerned the correct view of the middle way, kind of conversing about it, kind of chatting over tea, probably. I can't imagine, they were doing drinks or anything. Then one of the figures, said to be Buddha Palita, came over to Tsongkhapa bearing a wrapped text and touched the top of his head with it in this dream. Following the symbolism of his dream, the next morning Tsongkhapa plunged into Buddha Palita's exposition of Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, and the fundamental treatise, fundamental wisdom, that is said to be the source of the middle way view that we follow. Tsongkhapa read and read, reflecting every now and then and meditating on crucial points of Buddha Palita's presentation of the philosophy of emptiness. I might point out that there's actually a fairly new translation of this. I've started reading it, but I just haven't had time with all the other preparations and things I do to read it, but I'm really looking forward to it. It's said to be kind of the main text that took what Nagarjuna taught in terms of the middle way into the Prasangika view. Although Nagarjuna was also teaching the Prasangika view, it didn't get delineated as such until Buddha Palita's text. Just so you know a little history of those other figures, Bhavaviveka came around to actually refute some of what Buddha Palita put forward, saying you're going too far. And that's what formed that other middle way school, the autonomy school, the Svatantrikas. They kind of were a branch of Bhavaviveka's thinking because they said, no, you can't go to inherent existence. Let's talk about some level of imputational existence, but not that far. Well, then Chandrakirti, who's come to be the standard bearer for the deeper investigation into Prasangika middle way, he clarified the view that Buddha Palita had already put forward and refuted Bhavaviveka in his great treatise, which is called the Supplement to the Middle Way. This is the text we studied in the master's program, and it is the main one used in Gelugpa monasteries to discern this view of the middle way. Again, just a little footnote to all of that. Some of you may know all that, but so again, Tsongkhapa is reading this. As Tsongkhapa was reading and meditating on the 18th chapter, remember that's one of the chapters His Holiness loves to teach on, the analysis of self and phenomena, all of a sudden, everything became crystal clear. All of Tsongkhapa's long-standing doubts, especially regarding how to find this extremely fine line, demarcating what is negated in emptiness and what is left untouched, vanished without a trace. He felt that nothing whatsoever was left for possible objectification, no object, no basis, no ground. Yet there was no danger, not even the slightest hint, of collapsing into nihilism or some kind of ineffable absolutism. Paradoxically, instead of being demolished, the world of cause and effect, right and wrong, samsara and nirvana seemed even more clear and regulated. Tsongkhapa knew exactly what Nagarjuna meant when he wrote centuries earlier, also from that same text, the 14th verse of the 24th chapter, to whom emptiness is possible, for him all is possible. To whom emptiness is impossible, for him nothing is possible. So this is a verse that really speaks to the reality that these two are complementary without a doubt. And Tsongkhapa was seeing this crystal clear at that moment, that the world of dependent arising and emptiness are completely enmeshed in each other. And again, one is looking at it from the side of, seeing its emptiness, its lack of inherent existence. The other is seeing its dependent existence. And these two are completely complementary. And it embraces all of the other teachings that the Buddha gave on karma, on rebirth, on everything as being completely valid within the sphere of the emptiness of those phenomena. All things exist. This is where we were talking a little bit last night after the teaching. Because of emptiness, you have to be meticulous in adhering to a respect for the conventional world. Because of emptiness, everything is possible. Without emptiness, nothing would be possible. So again, this is just amazing to hear. Thupta Jimpa has put this together really nicely, and it kind of gives you goosebumps when you think about Tsongkhapa having this realization after this amazing dream and the inspiration to read all of these texts, especially again Buddha Palita. So later, speaking of the impact of this experience, Tsongkhapa would tell his attendants the following: these days, with greater familiarity with insight into emptiness, even in the post-meditation periods when you're off your cushion, I would have the perception of this entire world of diversity as being empty, yet in an illusion-like manner, maintaining its specific forms. you come to hold an understanding of not just this reality of emptiness, but the illusory nature of all phenomena. That you aren't buying into reality in the way that you were before. You know that it's not real in the way that it appears. Because you do have that false appearance. Again, that's something you get rid of later. You first get rid of, as I said, with this threefold process Rinpoche talks about, first we get rid of the third step of stop believing in the false appearance. And then eventually the appearance goes away. When we're off the cushion after having a direct realization, they say that everything appears real, but you have no conviction. It's kind of like going back to the dream analogy. If you're an absolute lucid dreamer, if you're a lucid dreamer, then anytime you go into dreaming, as I understand, again, I've only had fleeting experiences of this, anytime you go into dreaming, you don't believe the dream at all. And you know it, and you can kind of use your dreamscape to do all these various things because it becomes part of the play of this illusory world, things being like an illusion. But you have a deep respect for it because they still function within that illusory nature. You don't lose this kind of reverence for the conventional world. In fact, that is the one thing I was going to share. Manjushri, one of the quotes that is in Dependent Arising and Emptiness by Elizabeth Napper, from what Manjushri told Tsongkhapa in his quest for this perfect view of the middle way, was to value conventionalities, value the conventional world. I think in Buddhism too often we hear this, and this is what Jack was bringing up too last night, that we hear emptiness and we think that it's, we have to know what it's emptiness of. Don't think it's emptiness of functionality or existence at a very cursory level. It's embracing all of that. Value conventionalities. They're the way to get there. You have to have these two wings again. The wing that understands emptiness through that deep wisdom, and the wing that is embracing the compassionate path that we are practicing, that is utilizing this world that we live in. That's why when I teach, as I did up in New York, on the environment and what's happening, and a deeper sense of ecology that we need to have, it means having absolute respect for all of that. Don't think because this is all happening to our world, it doesn't matter because there's lots of other places I can be reborn in or whatever. No, I mean, this is a world that is arising based on causes and conditions. It's empty of inherent existence, but it still exists. So value conventionalities. There's one more little bit that I'm going to read, and then I will go on to the text. At the heart of Tsongkhapa's breakthrough experience was a profound realization of the equation or quality of emptiness and dependent origination. It is one thing to declare that there is no contradiction between emptiness and dependent origination, that the two can converge in a single locus without logical conflict. It is something quite different, however, to understand this at a level where emptiness is dependent origination, and dependent origination is emptiness. In Nagarjuna's language, the meaning of emptiness is dependent origination, which is another way of expressing the well-known formula that we all know from the Heart Sutra, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is nothing other than form itself. Form is nothing other than emptiness. Speaking of this equation, a few years later, Tsongkhapa would write, the statement that dependent origination becomes the meaning of emptiness is relevant only for the Madhyamika, who has negated intrinsic existence by means of valid cognition. It is not just for anyone, right? Because again, too many people will hear that things are dependent arising, but they don't equate it to emptiness. You kind of have to work with these two concepts in tandem so that you get the full import of both of them. That's why this weekend we're going to mostly look at the reasoning of dependent arising, kind of the things we've talked about, and Tsongkhapa's great reverence for this. But you also should accompany this with those investigations into emptiness that the Buddha also taught, where you kind of arrive at that lack of inherent existence. We'll go into one of those maybe as part of the weekend, though I'm sure most of you know, like the 4-point analysis, where we're analyzing for the real I. These are important to do because they also complement what we're doing. We kind of get to that side that says things lack any inherent existence, but then we have to go back and go, oh yeah, but they still do have a conventional existence. They're dependent arisings. And then we grasp at that too tightly and they go, but they lack inherent existence. But they arise dependently. And you kind of go back and forth between these. His Holiness talks about this in his book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. That's the technique he advises, is alternating between these two. As I said, this weekend we'll mostly look at the dependent arising, but it's to also help us to discern the complete compatibility with emptiness. He says this is because, it's not relevant for just anyone, but only for that Madhyamika person. This is because when such a Madhyamika person ascertains external and internal phenomena as dependent originations, through the force of that very cognition itself, they will realize that things are devoid of intrinsic existence. This is what we're kind of driving at, what Tsongkhapa was getting, I think, in that wonderful, experience that he had, where he came so clearly to see that these are absolutely the same thing. We conceptualize them different. Yes, one is looking at things arising on these three levels, causes and conditions, parts, imputation, and the other is looking at the emptiness of intrinsic inherent existence. They're conceptually different. They're the same nature. And everything that exists is together with those two natures. Without a doubt. There's nothing that has any intrinsic existence, and there's nothing that isn't a dependent arising, as we saw in that quote. Therefore, all things are dependently arising, all things are empty. Okay. Maybe I'm beating a dead horse here, but we'll be doing that a bit this weekend. Again, we are looking at this praise then. We're going to go into the text. It's called a praise of dependent origination. But nonetheless, it's the Tsongkhapa praising the Buddha for teaching dependent origination. It's kind of like a implicit praise of the Buddha through explicitly praising dependent origination. So it's kind of a nice thing to work with. I did mention that I received teachings on this text from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It was in April of 2007 in San Francisco. I will say that at that teaching, he decided, I guess he looked at the text and he thought, well, maybe I don't want to talk about this for the full time. He introduced another text by Nagarjuna that is a praise to the Buddha in a very similar vein. As I said, this is kind of a staple of these great middle way masters to praise the Buddha for having taught dependent origination. And so Tsongkhapa is kind of following in the footsteps of Nagarjuna. It seemed like, going back to my notes when I put them all together and put them in Word, preparing for this, that he spent more of the time actually teaching that text than he did teaching this one, but it's the same subject matter, so we'll try to incorporate all of that. So let me, before going on to the actual text, let me stop here and take a breath and also see what questions people might have, because I've gone through a lot of material in the time we've been together so far. So you want to give your spiel on questions? Thank you.
So of course, if you are on Zoom, just raise your hand, get our attention. And if you're on YouTube, you can put your question in the chat. If you're in the Kadampa, just let me know, and either I will bring the mic around or Mike will bring the mic around.
Any questions or comments? Comments are welcome too. Yeah, Robbie has something. Yeah.
Thank you. We also talk about, and you may not want to go into this, but we also talk about the conventional truth and the ultimate truth of phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How does that align with
Mm-hmm.
the dependent arising and the emptiness of a phenomena?
Right. Yeah, I will be going into that, but for now I can say, just to give a brief answer to your question, Robbie, is that in general we say that kind of the conventional reality that is anything other than emptiness, everything we call, conventional truth, that is what always is together with an ultimate truth. These two again are being posited kind of together, inextricably bound up with everything that exists. So again, we can say that emptiness is also a dependent arising. So it gets a little tricky because emptiness is usually what we refer to as ultimate truth. And by the way, ultimate truth doesn't mean things have ultimate existence. It means that when we investigate for ultimate existence, things having a final mode of being from their own side, this is the truth we find, that they don't have that they lack that. So it gets a little tricky even with the word ultimate. Ultimate truth is the truth we find when we look for that intrinsic existence and we see the lack of it, it is an emptiness. So everything that is in the category of ultimate truth is essentially an emptiness. They also include true cessations in there, but that's because they consider them to be emptinesses. But anyway, that's a side point. Everything that is an emptiness is together with something that is a conventional truth. like the emptiness of the clothespin, and the emptiness of the computer, and the emptiness of you, and the emptiness of the chair, and the emptiness of your head, and the emptiness of, I mean, there are infinite emptinesses, because there are even the emptinesses of those emptinesses. Because that is there's nothing that stands on its own, that is autonomous. So we can posit anything in relation to its emptiness, but in general we say everything that is a conventional truth are all those things that are established through worldly convention. And as I said, I'll go into the criteria even for how we posit. There are 3 criteria to say that something actually exists as a conventionality, as a conventional truth. So that's kind of the idea behind it. Is in general, we would say, yes, everything on the dependent arising side is a conventional truth. Everything that is an emptiness is an ultimate truth. But it gets tricky, because even emptiness is dependent arising. Depends upon a basis upon which we establish the lack of inherent existence. That lack of inherent existence defines what we mean by an emptiness. It doesn't stand alone. I know that's a tricky one. We start talking about the emptiness of emptiness, it gets then the emptiness of the emptiness of emptiness. I won't go there, but
And the dependent arising of the emptiness of the emptiness.
exactly, because everything is a dependent arising. So we don't, you can't really talk about them individually. I mean, they're always related to things. They have the dependent arising of emptiness and the emptiness of emptiness and so on. But in general, what we refer to as conventional truth are those things that the world does establish to be so. And again, the criteria we'll look at shortly for that. Thank you. Yeah, any other questions or comments? Was there anyone in the Zoom room who would like to say anything?
Not that I'm seeing.
Okay. Just so you know, I mean, this is a 2-hour session. If you do feel the need, to get up and stretch or something, because it's a long time to sit. I've been lately teaching generally about an hour and a half on Zoom, because I know that people find it difficult to sit for that long. But, feel free to stand up, do whatever you need to do. You can go to the back of the room and stretch. It won't bother me, at all. So I want people to have that permission. This afternoon, with a little bit longer session, I think it's 2.5 hours, I will do a little break about an hour and 15 minutes in or something, just that people do have a chance to get up and use the restroom, whatever you need to do. Let's go to the text. Excited about this. As I said last night, I've never really taught the entire text, but I did do an introduction to it prior to going to the teachings with His Holiness. And that material that we just went through is actually what I put together for the group that we went through kind of to get our heads around this topic before heading off to San Francisco. Quite a few of us from Tupten Norberling and Santa Fe went. So we have a couple of main outlines. If we go to the outline, the bigger outline, we see that there's item 1, the offering of praise. That's the very first verse. The body of the text is the actual explanation, right? Verses 2 through 53. And then we finally have a little closing thing at the very bottom, which is the conclusion and Lama Tsongkhapa's dedication, which are these last several verses. And then we see again that each of these divided in, well, the middle one in particular divided into a bunch of other sections. But let's go right to the praise, the offering of praise. This is the very first verse. He who speaks on the basis of seeing, this makes him a knower and teacher unexcelled. I bow to you, O conqueror, you who saw dependent origination and taught it. So he's, again, very quite specifically making an homage to the Buddha, because the Buddha is the teacher of dependent origination. He's the teacher of a lot of other things that are worthwhile. It's not to say that this is the only thing the Buddha taught that is, but as we said last night when we looked at some of those initial quotes, this could be said to be everything the Buddha taught in some way, because the Four Noble Truths is a process of dependent origination, right? Based on the causes and conditions that we create of our own karma and delusions, we experience dukkha. And then, of course, the opposite. If we want the last 2 truths, if we practice the path, engaging in the path, it creates the causes and conditions to experience nirvana, the cessation of all of our dukkha. Everything that exists is a part of the world of dependent origination. So the Buddha was very much teaching dependent origination, even when he wasn't explicitly teaching it in this manner. But also this bit in here where he says, he who speaks on the basis of seeing, you kind of have 2 things going on there, right? You have the Buddha speaking, teaching. This is, of course, the main way that Buddhas help other beings, right? There's that wonderful quote about the Buddhas do not, remove suffering like you would remove a thorn from a hand. They also don't wash away all of our afflictions and negativities like you would wash dirt out of a cloth. They also don't take the realizations they have and plant them in the minds of beings. How do the Buddhas help sentient beings? By teaching the Dharma. And that's really the reality. When we put all of our faith in the Buddha, it's not that we expect, these divine beings to come in and intervene and clear away all the garbage for us and everything. That's not what they do. They can help us if we have the karma to have maybe those things happen. But the main way that Buddhas are helping us is teaching the Dharma. So we have in that very first statement, he who speaks, he who teaches the Dharma on the basis of that own insight. Kind of is speaking in a sense to even the ultimate welfare of a Buddha, which is combined in their own welfare through having seen reality, seen the truth of emptiness and taken it to its greatest degree so that they've removed all of these obscurations and attained Buddhahood. But it's also the fulfillment of others' welfare, because then they can teach to others. We delineate these as being involved in what are called the Dharmakaya and the Rupakaya, which are fancy terms for essentially the mental component of a Buddha and the physical components of Buddhas. Because Buddhas don't just come, they don't check out after realizing their, greatest realization, become a Buddha, and they hang out at the Buddha bar with all these great beings, discussing things. They're involved in the world, right? They need a form, bodies in which they can appear. And that's what we mean by Rupakaya. It's translated as form bodies. It's essentially all the ways that Buddhas can appear, which is said to be exactly in accord with the karma of other beings. So like I said, Manjushri was appearing to Tsongkhapa. That was a Rupakaya of a Buddha that was appearing in a physical form, so teachings can be given. You can't get teachings from the mind of a Buddha, right? I mean, I can't know the mind of a Buddha. Don't go into some sort of trance and do a Vulcan mind meld or something. I can't become one with the Buddha's mind. Just like, we have those dimensions to our own experience, right? We have our own personal world that is our world of our thoughts and everything that's going on. And then we have our social dimension where we are interacting with other beings. Buddhas are no different. They have both aspects. They have that personal abiding in this unbelievable state of bliss and well-being because they've removed everything that obscures the mind. And that gets active in the world through these forms. So kind of interesting, this first line is just speaking about both of those being culminated in the aspect of a Buddha, the ability to having seen everything, reality, to its greatest degree and removed everything that obscures the mind, and then to teach the Dharma from that place. That's the main reason why Buddhas exist. They also can help with, again, if we have the karma to have a Buddha rescue us when we're, drowning in a pool or something, that may happen. But that's not the main reason why Buddhas exist. The main reason is to teach the Dharma, because the Dharma is what will get rid of suffering once and for all. Whereas if you only get rid of the suffering in the moment, it's meaningful, but it's not the ultimate. It's not the final goal. And recall also that Buddhas do teach in accord with the dispositions of beings. And that's why we looked at the 3 wheel turnings at the beginning. We can see the Buddha taught at different times in different ways to different beings. Because we all need a different medicine based on where we're at in our spiritual development. What we are studying, which is based on that second wheel turning, the turning of the Dharma chakra, of the lack of intrinsic existence, this is said to be the subtlest view. But it's not something that people right off the bat are ready for. You might need to hear other teachings. The Buddha gave provisional teachings, and even things that were refuted later, which gets to be kind of head-scratching for us. If you go to another tradition, I do, again, a lot of interfaith work. If I went to my Christian friends and I said, well, the Buddha sometimes said things are this way, but then he completely negated it later on by saying they're not. They'd go, well, why are you following this person, right? You want somebody who seems to have some consistency, who actually says the truth all the time. We like that in our society, right? Generally. Most people do. So the thing is that the Buddha was doing that for a reason. It's what's called upaya, or skillful means. This is what Buddhas do. They know the minds of beings, so they know exactly what will hit them at that moment. I'll give this person that teaching, and I'll give this person another teaching. That's why the Buddha started with the 4 Noble Truths. As difficult as that is even to realize, that's a very, kind of Oh, I'm sorry, I should have taken it off screen. All these poor people online and recording. All those people that needed that initial teaching of the Buddha to wake up to reality, to see that they are involved in samsara, to kind of develop some urge to move away from that towards nirvana. That's already very profound. That's the Buddha's field of like trying to get people to not just get some temporal benefit from his teachings, but to find some ultimate benefit. But then he goes on to teach even deeper levels of how things exist, and the second wheel turning of giving us these profound teachings on emptiness. This is how Buddhas actually go about their business, is to know the minds of beings and teach in accord with them, and appear in accord with them. We have the amazing fortune. Rinpoche used to say this all the time, where he'd say, be glad that your guru isn't appearing to you in the form of a dog, because you might learn something from a dog. Dogs do have things to teach us, perhaps, but they can't teach us the Dharma. They can't, bark the Dharma at us. Woof, 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 Oh, you're talking about the truth of suffering. Okay, what do you have to say? We need human beings to appear to us. We need people to relate to us. This is the concept of the guru in Buddhism that we all adhere to in the Tibetan tradition, that our gurus are more likely than not to be that manifestation compared to other beings. I don't think we find Buddhas appearing as our politicians. I mean, maybe a few, but probably not. They're not appearing as corporate leaders or business people in the world. Where are Buddhas appearing? Most likely candidate is our spiritual guides, people like His Holiness Rinpoche and so on, that are actually helping us through teaching the Dharma. This is what Buddhists do. I'm not saying I'm a Buddha, don't get that, because I'm teaching you. I'm way, way, way below the Buddhists, right? So don't think that for a second. Don't think that I have any realization of emptiness. I've got some understanding through my study, but nothing beyond that. But nonetheless, those beings that are taking that primary role of teaching the Dharma, giving tantric initiations, helping beings in their path, those could very well be Buddhas appearing in this world. So this is the idea behind that. There's also a reference in that verse, we'll go back to it in a moment, to the word conqueror, or sometimes it's translated as subduer. And this is, of course, the Buddha being able to subdue or conquer what are often called the four maras, to have actually, completely eliminated any fear of them, any influence from them. These four maras kind of symbolically appeared to the Buddha in the story of his enlightenment, right, where he's achieving these realizations and these beings are appearing and throwing weapons at him, and these weapons become flowers, through the Buddha's wisdom and what have you. The four maras, or demons, are sometimes translated. Only one of them is really another being, and it would be a being that we have some sort of karmic connection with that can manifest in a way to disturb our minds. That one's called the Devaputra Mara, the Mara of the son of the gods. And it's essentially a being that has up to mischief, mayhem. I kind of picture it to be a little bit like Cupid, that kind of shoots you with an arrow that causes you to then, be carried away with your emotions and things like that. I don't know. I don't know whether that being is actually kind of out there, but this is how it's taught. The other three are all things within our own continuum. We have the Mara of the afflictions. And these are all the garbage that we're trying to get rid of. I won't go into the whole litany of all of them. We know these. We have the Mara of the aggregates. I'll put up on the screen shortly the 5 aggregates, but essentially it means our mind and body. It means that we have this kind of demon that is just being embodied in this existence that we have to contend with. And then we have the Mara of the Lord of Death, which sounds like it's a being, but it's essentially meaning that we're all subject to mortality. This is kind of a demon in and of itself. Perhaps for some of us it's kind of a bit daunting, because we can even get very far in this life, but the reality is it's going to come to an end. We're going to have to, if we haven't achieved these amazing realizations through our practice and attain some sort of deep progress, we will get reborn again. We will have to go through a shedding of these aggregates and go on to the next life. This is kind of what we're all under the control of to some degree. So the Buddha has appeased all, put them all at peace. There's no longer any fear of these four maras. We don't have any need to be concerned about them. This is what the Buddha has subdued or conquered. And he has also, of course, subdued all of these obscurations. In general, we talk about kind of 2 levels of obscuration. Remember, I talked about how we have Rinpoche's process of, we see the basis and label it. We then It appears to us as real, and then we assent to that. The first of kind of getting rid of that, assenting to it, is what we call the afflictive obstructions or obscurations. These are the ignorance that is grasping at it to be real, and all the other afflictions, because they're together with that. All of our afflictions, remember in the tree of samsara, we have both wholesome and unwholesome things arising with that ignorance. But the afflictive states, the unwholesome ones, they depend upon ignorance. They are always together with ignorance, with this false view. Whereas the wholesome ones can be extricated from that and upheld. So again, when we get rid of the afflictive obstructions, we get rid of the tree of samsara. The roots of all of that are uprooted and we no longer experience cyclic existence. That's the first level of obscuration that we have to remove, even on the bodhisattva path, even on the path to Buddhahood. But then you have to get rid of that second factor of the appearance of inherent existence. Remember, I said a short while ago, that's caused by these imprints in our minds because we've had ignorance since beginningless time. Just kind of a head scratcher too, right? Beginningless time. When I talk to my Christian friends about that, they go, no, that can't be, Because of course they have a strong adherence to a creator God that kind of set the whole thing in motion. Well, because Buddhism subscribes to dependent arising, there's always got to be, again, something ahead of, prior to it. And so for our minds too, there's no beginning. Our minds go back without an initial moment. So again, we've had these imprints from ignorance that have been stored up in the mind based on having never gotten rid of it. And that causes this false appearance. So these deep imprints and the false appearance that arises on the basis of them are the last thing we have to remove. Those are called the knowledge obstructions or the obstructions to omniscience. That's what's keeping you from being a Buddha, really. That's the goal of a bodhisattva. To become this subduer, this conqueror who has not just removed the afflictions, but removed even these subtle imprints. That's what allows you to have this omniscient mind of a Buddha. So a bit more commentary than I'll give in every verse in terms of individual words, but I wanted to explain those in particular. So let's go back to the text and return to the next verse. So again, we see that conqueror is mentioned in the third line there. Again, some translations will say subduer. And this is bowing to the Buddha who saw dependent origination at all of its levels and completely, and then taught it. He who speaks on the basis of seeing. He saw it and taught it. Again, the same thing mirrored in those last two lines that we saw in the very first line. Let's go on then to the next verse. We're getting into the actual explanation. Again, this is the bulk of the text from verse 2 all the way through to verse 53. We have a section of 3 verses that are actually really quite nice. And this is where I'm going to do a bit of commentary. And then in the 5th is where I do a lot more. And then the rest of the text, some, but not so much. First, the reason for praising Buddha's teaching of dependent arising. And what is the reason? Because, of course, Tsongkhapa has seen the value of dependent arising. So in verse 2, he says, whatever degenerations there are in the world, the root of all these is ignorance. You taught that it is dependent origination, the seeing of which will undo this ignorance. Again, so we go back to that tree. I didn't keep it up as a shot that we could do on the screen, but remember we have the tree that has the roots of ignorance, the trunk I was calling kind of those different states of mind, wholesome, unwholesome, what have you. That includes all these afflictions and stuff, again, that depend upon the ignorance. The other ones are simply arising from it because that's all we know is ignorance. We've never been free of it. And then the karma we create is the branches, and then the fruit of that karma that arise from all of that. You want to uproot the whole thing. Dependent arising, dependent origination is the way to do that. Because it's through realizing dependent origination in its deepest level that emptiness is realized. So again, this is this ignorance that we talk about. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that at this point, because it is, as was said, important, again, in what Don shared last night, Don Brown, that we really get clear about what that is. What does that mean? To think things inherently exist from their own side. I mean, Rinpoche uses the word real. And when we say, he says the object of negation, when we analyze the I, the self that we are with all the time, that is one of the most important ones to begin with, that we actually think about that being a real I. What does that mean? It means the I that we think is real in our everyday experience. Because once more, and if you start thinking nihilistically, just on that statement, if you start thinking, well, I'm getting rid of my real I, I'm getting rid of my real computer and my real books and my real friends and my real world, then I'm getting rid of the whole world. You're getting rid of a way of seeing the world that is saying it has its own reality. You know, again, that phrase that Elizabeth Napper used, that also Jeffrey Hopkins used, things having their own thing, their kind of own thingness. They have something, an essence from their own side that dictates what they are. That's what we're trying to negate. That is the gakcha. That is the object of negation in translating that Tibetan term. That is what we are holding to through this ignorance, is that things have their own reality, that they are what we have merely designated them as. Now, when we say, kind of just to jump over to the other side, because if you do start falling into a nihilistic bent when you hear that there is no real I, there is no real you, there is no real anything, you think, oh, well, then things don't exist at all. Things do exist, but they're merely designated. But we don't say mere designation in the sense of like, I can't say, oh, wow, do you see the elephant in the room? I mean, that's not in the way we sometimes say, nobody's talking about the elephant in the room. I mean, a real elephant, you know, trunk and ears and tail and all, you know, right there in the middle of the room. We have to have a basis for it. There always is a basis upon which something is imputed. What we're getting at, though, is that there's nothing in the basis that dictates what it is. It has no reality from its own side that makes me, again, say, well, then it's elephant. They actually say that even right there, the fact that we have to do that first step of calling something something else, we see that basis of the trunk and the ears and the huge body and the tail and all that, and we go, oh, that's an elephant. That already shows that it can't have any inherent existence as elephant, because we would know it as elephant otherwise. This again gets to that subtle level of understanding that if things are merely designated, merely imputed, if it's called an elephant, then there cannot be a real elephant. It's a merely designated elephant, merely imputed elephant. That should be enough right there to tell us things don't have that reality that we think they do. But they still appear that way. That's the tricky part, as I said, because the elephant, if you go to the zoo and see an elephant, because I don't think we want to bring an elephant in here, probably wouldn't get it through the door even, unless it's a baby elephant. But if we, want to go experience that, be with an elephant, you see it seems to have elephantness all over it, right? From the tail to the tip of the tail to the tip of the trunk, everything in between. It's elephantness. This is where maybe we will do this investigation into, well, let's go look for that elephantness that seems to be so real. Not just a merely designated elephant, because that's not to be refuted. That's how things actually exist. There's this basis of the trunk and the tail and the body and the legs and all of that, and we impute elephant. We designate elephant on that. So if we go looking for the sense of a real elephant that appears to us so vividly when we're in the presence of an elephant, well, where would it possibly exist? Most likely place is on that collection of stuff, right? Least likely place is that an elephant somehow exists elsewhere in some sort of concrete, substantial way, but that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because when I see that stuff, that's when I think elephant. That's when I see elephant. So that's the more likely thing, that basis of stuff actually has the real elephant. The real elephant is located there. It has to be located there. It seems to be there. Well, start investigating. Where is it? Is it in the trunk? Is it in the ears? Left ear, right ear, tip of the ear, inside the ear? Is it the tail, tip of the tail, the entire tail, part of the tail? Where do you find it? And you might say, well, what's the collection of the parts? Well, that seems to say that there's a bunch of things involved, right? And so are there, if we even just say there are, there's quite a few parts to an elephant, right? Infinite parts to an elephant in the end. But if we say that each of those parts, that collection of parts is an elephant, well, then you have that many elephants because every one of them is a part. What is a collection? A collection is a bunch of stuff, right? It's not a unitary phenomenon. A collection of parts is multiple. So then we must have multiple elephants if there's a real elephant there. This is that investigation. We often call that the 4-point analysis. We first get real clear about what it is that we are negating, this gakcha, that the ignorance is holding to. The real elephant, the real I, the real you, the real everything. It's all around us all the time. Like I said, we're like fish swimming in it, and we can't even see it because we're immersed in it so clearly, or so fully. We have to see it by starting to investigate. What exactly is that false layer that is being imputed, or again, designated by my mind in a false way? I'm merely imputing the elephant, but then I'm throwing on through my conceptual mind all kinds of stuff, layering on this inherent existence. Of course, on the basis of that, I also layer on all kinds of other ideas. But it starts with me thinking that elephant is real, that person is real, that I is real. We identify that, that's the first point. Then we kind of say, just like I did, well, what are the possibilities of where that could really be there? If it's a real elephant or a real I, it's either going to be the same as the basis, or finding something on the basis that is equivalent to it, or it's going to be something completely different. Again, very unlikely that it's completely different, unrelatedly different, because that doesn't make sense, right? I go to the zoo to see the elephants, and I don't look at those big gray things in the pen. I go looking elsewhere and go, oh, there's the elephants. There's no elephant that exists kind of over there. It's always together with these parts. Okay, so after those first two steps, you then look in those two places. You can do it as kind of looking. You can also kind of see the consequences if it was real in the way that you thought it was real. But I'm going to avoid that for right now. Let's go looking. Again, just like I said, is it in the tail? Is it in the ears? Is it in the trunk? Where do I find the elephant to exist? And if you think it's the entirety of the elephant, well, again, that collection or entirety, that's speaking to something else. There's always something that are related to that is multiple. So in and of itself, it becomes multiple. So you have some consequences there that are undesirable. And you can search the elephant all day. Search the basis for the elephant all day, and you don't find the real elephant. You can search the basis for a person all day, and you won't find the real person. Not in the body, not in the mind, not in any part of the body or mind, not in the collection of the body and mind. We sometimes call the mind-body complex. It doesn't exist. You come to the conclusion after doing this deeper investigation that it's unfindable. The real I cannot be, it doesn't sustain analysis. It's nothing that you can pinpoint. In fact, it becomes more elusive the more you look. If it existed in the way it appeared, it would become clearer immediately. You'd be like, oh yeah, there it is. Get it right away. I found the real I. I would encourage to do this investigation and to even see what are the consequences if you do find something you think is the real I. Or you do find something you think is the real elephant. Well, then everything else that is not that is not involved in that. So if we say that the real I is my mind, well, then the body is completely negligent. What's happening to the body isn't happening to me at all, because I'm the mind, right? I, in this real way, am the mind. Or if I'm the body, well, then everything that's going on in my mind isn't experienced by the I. Doesn't make sense either, right? That's where the consequences come in handy to kind of see what are the ramifications if the I that is held to be so real is found in this collection of stuff. Just, there's disconnect. It's not logical. Again, once you get into these investigations and you pursue them, that's that emptiness side that we need to keep looking for what we think is real, this gakcha, and come to refute it, come to see that it doesn't exist in that way. And that thing that we are holding to doesn't exist at all. As they often say, there's not even an atom of inherent or independent existence. Nothing has it, not even emptiness has it. Everything is a dependent arising, is relative. Okay, so again, this investigation would go on then to the fourth one, which again can be refuted pretty easily. Because if I say, okay, the elephant, the real elephant is something other than the parts of the elephant, well then again, take the parts of the elephant out of the room. That basis for the elephant, take it out of the room. Is an elephant still there? Well, no. Take mentally the mind and body off the cushion or chair that you're sitting on right now and set it aside. Is the I still on the chair? No, the I is going to travel with the mind and the body. It's kind of together with those and designated on the basis of those. So we have a sense of I that is with the mind and body, but not completely separate. Now, why do they have to include that? Well, it's because you have to be sure to exhaust the possibilities. So you don't have some wandering doubt that, well, maybe I didn't find it in any of those places. Maybe it's something other than that. But in fact, there are even schools of thought, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, that adhere to some sense of something that is you, that is not the mind or body. We even have this to some degree in Christianity. Again, I was raised Catholic and I was taught about my immortal soul, right? Some of you are Catholic, remember that. I never got clear about what that was. I'm not sure what even visual image I had for that. Where is my immortal soul? Can you point it out for me, please? In the Vedic traditions that the Buddha was raised in, they have what's called the Atman. The Atman is said to be kind of this separate self that goes on from life to life, that is the common thread through all of these existences, that is who you kind of are at your deepest nature, or whatever. It eventually unites with, I don't know a lot about the Vedic traditions, but it unites with like Brahma or Vishnu or whatever, and kind of that's the moksha that they experience when they have their liberation. Again, we do have to perhaps look at whether we carry that kind of concept. Do I believe in an immortal soul still, having been indoctrinated into that when I was quite young? Is there something else that is me, that is not the mind or body? But the Buddha says you won't find that. And I would challenge, I'm not, again, down on anyone who believes in these things, but what is the basis for that? Where is it? Point to me the basis for an immortal soul or for an Atman. So again, that analysis can be done pretty easily by simply removing what is the basis for that phenomenon, such as the I, setting my mind and body to the side, or the elephant, setting the parts of the elephant to the side, and saying, does the phenomenon exist there on its own, completely independent of those parts? When you get to the conclusion that you haven't found it through the third step, you haven't found it through the fourth step, you revisit the second step and go, hey, those were the only two possibilities. Because is there a third possibility? I can't think of one. Is there something that would not be the same as or different from? Just like when we say, there are the things that are here and there, right? Is there anything that is not here or there? There being pretty wide expanse. There is everything else. Me and other, self and other. Everything else is other. It kind of goes on endlessly. So too, if we say if there's things that are we look for whether it's the same or whether it's different, there's not really a third possibility. So if we come back to that and understand that those are the only two possibilities and we didn't find it, guess what, folks? This first thing that we were looking for doesn't exist. And we've believed in it from beginningless time, contrary to the fact that it doesn't exist. We've been duped by our own ignorance. Okay, let me see if there are any questions. I know we didn't get far in the verses, but trust me, we'll get through them. The Dalai Lama always gets through verses right. He just starts rattling them off at the end of the teaching and giving like a couple of words commentary. But we'll hopefully do more than that. But any questions on anything I've said in this latter part of today, or comments? Yeah, Jack, please.
It struck me, excuse me, when you were saying, show me the Atman, show me the soul.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the mind?
This is a good point.
They're
right.
all show me's.
Right. I think the thing we have to do when we analyze, well, what is the basis for mind, is that we know mind quite intimately because we're always with mind. We have thoughts, right? That's one part of the landscape of the mind. We're not saying that is the totality of mind. We also have sensations in the mind, our sense consciousnesses that are experiencing tastes and tactile sensations and what have you. Mind can't be pointed to in a physical way. But when I said what's the basis, I don't necessarily mean a physical basis. I mean, what would you say is the basis? If they say that soul is another name for mind, then I'd be like, well, okay, yeah, mind goes on from life to life. If you want to call it a soul, but don't think that it's something completely independent then of mind and body, and that it is a real I then. Because it can't be a real I. Because if it boils down to it being mind, mind isn't I, as we just saw when we analyzed. That we can have some kind of identification of the I with the mind at times, but if the I, the real I, is the mind, then all of our physical experiences can't be a part of the domain of that mind because they aren't known by that mind, by that I. That I is only the mind. So I guess it gets to be tricky, but I would say that, again, when I say, show me a basis for a soul or an Atman, I don't mean point to it physically. I mean, what is it that is serving as that? And if it's simply mind, then I am back at the same point and saying, well then, is there a real I that is this soul that is the mind? It would fall apart under the same analysis. Is there something you can think of, Jack, that would be a basis for that sense of self that would not be mind? Or
No, I just know that when we look at those three things from a Buddhist perspective,
right,
we're talking about something that is Hindu driven typically
right,
and Christian driven, and we talk like we know.
what their
But
thing is, yeah.
like you and I both grew up as Catholic,
Right,
and so at the end of the day, I can look at mind and I can look at soul as the same thing. When somebody who does not have that background
Mhm.
talks about soul, they say, no, that's an unchanging thing. Well, I grew up as it's everything I do. It's the same thing that a mind becomes, and at the end it goes somewhere.
right,
But none of them are touchable,
right,
and they are
exactly.
associated with the aggregates.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we can't find those sort of tangible things that we can point to, but we can still find that there is something that we say is the basis for designating mind. I guess the question would be, if we were to kind of have a Buddhist debate with folks who do believe in this soul or Atman, we would go to that place. Well, what is the basis for that phenomenon? And if they say that the basis for it is the mind, well, like I said, we run to the same conclusions, the same problems, same difficulties. So, okay. Any other comments before we have our lunch break? Yeah. Yes, please, Elise.
I guess all that and Jack was just saying is it makes it really difficult to not feel like there's some separate stream that goes on that's like an individual soul, because we're always taught about the effects of karma from one life to another.
Sure.
And how this whole life is a result of past karma and we're creating for future karma. Or where does that, how does that separate itself or integrate itself with the total karmas?
Right.
I think I understand what you're saying, but still it's really hard to really separate that.
So in terms of the individual experience of it, are you clear about that? Or, I mean, when you say, because let me explain it and then I'll see if it answers your question. I mean, the way that I see it, again, I'm not perfect in all my explanations. The way that I see it is that, again, you do have a continuum of consciousness, which again, we would say at the subtlest level is this clear light mind, this very subtle mind that is taught in Tantra, where you essentially have kind of a mind that is together with very subtle wind energy. It's like consciousness together with a physical component. These two are bound up together, and they have like a grosser form of experience that happens when we are embodied, right? Or even in the intermediate state and kind of subtler bodies. The only time when it's just clear light mind is when we go through the death process, and that manifests in this process of the unfolding of these layers of consciousness. There's a thread of consciousness that runs through all of these existences that is unique, that will go on to become a Buddha at some point when all the causes and conditions are in place for that to occur. That is the basis upon which we attend to karma and other things, is because essentially, although there's not a constant me or I that is experiencing that, there is a being nonetheless that is revolving around these manifestations of that kind of grow up around that consciousness. So that thread of consciousness came from my past life, it comes into this life. In this life, it was kind of surrounded by human consciousness, with all the aspects of human awareness and the ability to use an intellect to investigate these topics, to go to the master's program and study all of this and everything. If on my next life, that thread of consciousness, due to my being a horrible practitioner, goes down into some animal existence, and I experience suddenly, what it's like to have Tashi's mind, your dog's mind, well, then I'll have a very different experience, right? But the thread of consciousness that goes through it all is the same. Not the same meaning identical every moment, meaning the same thread. There's no utter kind of annihilation of you and something else. Something still does go forward. Again, I've had some people in classes where I've taught this at the beginning, especially when people are quite new, they might say, well, but couldn't we call that a soul? Well, you can call it whatever you want to some degree, but Buddhism would never use the term soul because it's not how we see that concept. That concept is something that, again, is a sort of unchanging, unitary thing that is quite separate from mind. I think this is how the Vedic traditions would define it. I don't know for sure, because I've never studied the Vedic traditions. I'm always curious if people have that knowledge, if they would, certainly they're welcome to share it. But the reality is that in Buddhism, this is why we posit the necessity of tending to all of that, is because the being is still experiencing the continual rebirth, cyclic existence, regardless of the emptiness of that being or the lack of a soul or whatever else is being posited. There still is that conventional experience. But it's maintaining that continuity by virtue of this thread of consciousness that goes through it all. Let's analyze. Is that thread of consciousness the real I? Well, once more, then that would belie any experience that is not identical to that thread of very subtle consciousness. I'm not having that experience now. I'm having quite a gross experience of awareness and sitting in this body and, the pains of this body and everything. The pains of this on my ear. It kind of hits your temples in a weird place. It's nice to take it off for the breaks. But anyway, the idea is that we have these grosser levels of awareness that really aren't in line with some concept that this subtle awareness is the real I. The real I can't exist in that because that is not always manifest. It's not always what the I is experiencing. It's not what I identify as I. If that's all that I am, then there would never be any need for any rebirth. I wouldn't have anything else because that's the real I. It's findable to exist on its own as the I. But moreover, it wouldn't even require the label. I would just be referring to myself as subtle consciousness. Oh, there's some subtle consciousnesses out there, and I'm my own subtle consciousness. But instead, I think of that as an I that is more than that. It's a collection of stuff. So again, you do run into consequences that are difficult if I think that that's the real I. So karma is kind of the energy that creates the various manifestations of being around that thread of consciousness. And the eventual goal is to be free of the control of all of that and the delusions that give rise to that and the ignorance that's at the root of all of that, and to be able to then manifest in the ways that will benefit beings. That subtle consciousness goes on into Buddhahood. It's even examined, sometimes they have this idea that maybe in Buddhahood, it's all one, like you just become one with all of the minds of other Buddhas. Well, His Holiness emphasizes, you still have a thread of consciousness that we can say is that being who became that Buddha. But what is there to really differentiate one Buddha mind from another when they're completely omniscient mind that is mind is not physical, so it's unbounded. It permeates everywhere. So we can say that we are right now in the midst of all of the mind waves of all the Buddhas that are just trying to manifest in ways to help us. But there's nonetheless a specific Buddha that perhaps we have a closer connection with, like Buddha Shakyamuni, who Tsongkhapa is praising, is the Buddha of this world. He had the karma to come to this world, and we all have the karma to be sort of in the wake of his teachings and to experience them. So we are benefiting from that mind of that being much more than any other Buddhas because of the karmic connection that we have. So it makes sense to say that, again, this subtle consciousness is this thread that carries the whole thing. But that can't be the real I, and I would even pose that the Buddha would say it's not really even a soul either. It has some of the characteristics that they adhere to, right, of it being kind of what goes on after life. But again, most Christian traditions don't say there's anything beyond this life. They wouldn't say that it has some sort of, meaning existences, rebirth and what have you beyond this life. They would say there's heaven, hell, whatever beyond this life. I hope I made that clear. Does it lead to another question?
Are you saying that basically the difference between the Buddhist sense of mind stream, is that it's evolving, always evolving, versus soul and Atman, which are more static?
But by evolving, if you simply mean changing, I would say yes. Evolving meaning getting better, that's not necessarily the case, because we've been all over the place. They say we've often had, pretty opportune existences and experiences that we never really took advantage of. So, yes, it's changing all the time. Whereas there's this unchanging essence that I think is referred to certainly in the concept of Atman. I don't know about a soul. Again, I don't have full recollection of everything that was involved in my immortal soul. I had some idea of it being like a piece of God, like we all had a little piece of God with us. Angel Delphi, the little, oh, do it. You won't regret it. Oh, don't do it. That sort of thing. We better take our break. We're already 10 minutes after. Okay, so let's just very, very briefly dedicate this positive potential we've created through these last 2 hours together so that we can achieve the state of Buddhahood, have that perfection of our own being so we can help others in perfect ways, leading them on the path to discerning their deepest nature. All right, and then let's reconvene right around 1 o'clock or so then, 1:30. So if you're a little bit late, we'll probably want to give enough time for people to have lunch and what have you, but somewhere right around there we'll start, okay? 1:35.
And those of you online, I will stop Zoom, so just rejoin when you come back. I'll restart at about 1:15.
Okay, thank you
Bye.
all. Have a good lunch.